In the soft glow of a luxurious restaurant, a moment froze the air. A beautiful blonde woman in her 30s, dressed in an elegant white dress, sat quietly, clutching her phone with hidden pain. At the next table, a little girl in a bright red dress tugged at her widowed father's arm and whispered with innocent urgency, "Dad, she needs us!" He turned, stunned, realizing that what he was about to witness would challenge not only his heart but also the true meaning of family. And before we begin, let me wish you peace and health. Tell me, from which country and at what time are you watching this story? The dining room at Hen of the Wood in Burlington glowed with a gentle light that made every glass shimmer and every shadow feel alive. It was the kind of place where people lowered their voices and leaned closer to one another, where the scent of seared steak mixed with the faint sweetness of apple cider that drifted in when the door opened to the cool October night. Couples celebrated anniversaries, business partners shook hands over contracts, and old friends toasted to the harvest season. At nearly every table, there was a sense of belonging. Yet in the corner, by a window framed with falling red leaves, sat a young woman alone. Evelyn Hartman tried to keep her shoulders straight, though her fingers trembled as she smoothed the edge of the white tablecloth. She had saved for weeks to allow herself this evening, counting and recounting the wrinkled bills in her purse. $10, that was all she had brought, folded carefully as if the creases could protect her from humiliation. She had dreamed of blending in with the other guests, of being just another young woman on a hopeful date in an elegant restaurant. Her dress, a hand-me-down from her late mother, felt more like armor than fashion, and she wore it proudly despite the frayed seams. She had curled her hair that afternoon, standing in the mirror of her small rented room, convincing herself that with enough effort she could pass for someone who belonged here. Every time the door opened, she lifted her eyes. Her heart leapt at each new arrival, but then sank again when none of them walked toward her table. She tapped her phone nervously. The message thread still glowed with Trevor Collins's name. They had met online, exchanged jokes, and he had chosen this restaurant with confidence. "Trust me," he had written, "this place is perfect." At 6:45, she had arrived early, wanting a few minutes to calm herself. But now the clock pushed past 7. The chair across from her remained empty. The waiter had smiled politely when she ordered only water, not pressing her to choose from the menu. Evelyn had whispered a thank you, cheeks burning. Around her, silverware clinked and laughter bubbled. She tried to hold her chin high, to pretend she was waiting for someone important who would be there any moment. But the minutes dragged like heavy stones. Her phone vibrated at last, and she nearly dropped it in relief. The text froze her blood. "You really went? It was a joke. I'm not dumb enough to show up for someone like you." The words blurred on the screen, but she read them again and again, each time like a knife twisting deeper. Another buzz came. "Don't waste your time. You're not my type." The din of the restaurant faded into a distant roar, as if she were sealed in glass. Evelyn pressed the phone to the table and clenched her fists, refusing to let the tears fall here, not in front of strangers. She had been mocked before at school, at part-time jobs, but never in such a cruelly deliberate way. Tonight had been her chance to believe in something new, and even that had been taken. Across the room, at a larger table not far away, Nathaniel Whitmore set down his fork and watched. He was a man accustomed to polished evenings, his gray suit pressed sharp, his posture composed. To most of the town, he was Nate Whitmore, the widowed CEO who had built his company into a thriving, organic food empire. He carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who signed paychecks and attended board meetings. Yet at this moment, his eyes did not study spreadsheets or market reports. They lingered on the young woman by the window who fought so hard not to cry. He recognized the mask. He wore it himself when he went home to an empty house. But before he could look away, a small tug at his sleeve drew him back to the present. His daughter, Lila, sat beside him in her neat blue dress, legs swinging above the floor. At 7 years old, she was curious about everything, her eyes always seeking answers in places where adults saw only shadows. She leaned closer, whispering so only he could hear. "Dad, why is she so sad?" Nate glanced at her, startled. Lila had noticed before he had, and her voice carried none of the indifference that he often cultivated in business. He hesitated, his instinct telling him to brush off the question with a vague reply. Yet something in her tone reminded him of his late wife, a softness that asked not just for facts but for compassion. He shifted uncomfortably, searching for words. "Some people just have bad days," he murmured, hoping that would end it. But Lila's gaze returned to the lonely figure by the window, and her brows knitted with concern. She didn't look convinced. For a moment, Nate considered calling for the check, distracting his daughter with dessert, anything to avoid the tug of conscience. Yet even as he lifted his glass, he knew the image of that young woman sitting alone would not leave him easily. There was a familiarity in her posture, the way she straightened her back as if dignity alone could hold her together. The waiter returned with a basket of warm bread, setting it between Evelyn and the empty chair. She forced a smile of thanks, though she had no appetite. Her pulse still raced from the cruel message, her breath shallow as she debated whether to flee before anyone noticed. Pride was the only thing holding her in that seat. If she left too quickly, it would look like defeat. If she stayed too long, the emptiness would reveal itself even more plainly. Her fingers traced the rim of her water glass, the condensation cold against her skin. As she silently begged the world to swallow her whole, Lila watched without blinking. The innocence in her gaze made it impossible to dismiss what was happening just a few feet away. She tugged again at her father's sleeve, this time more firmly. "She needs help," the girl whispered, her voice small but steady. "Papa, she really does." Nate's jaw tightened. He wanted to correct her, tell her that strangers' lives were none of their business. That's what he had always told himself. The rule that protected him from entanglements since the night his wife passed and left him with a little girl to raise alone. He had poured his grief into work, into spreadsheets and boardrooms, into acquisitions that filled headlines but never his heart. And yet, confronted by his daughter's unwavering sincerity, he found himself without a defense. He risked another glance. Evelyn's face had gone pale, her lips pressed thin as she fought for composure. He saw the effort it took her to sit straight, the way her eyes shone though no tears fell. Something in that image mirrored his own reflection from sleepless nights in his office, loneliness veiled by stubborn dignity. The memory of his wife's laughter brushed against him like a ghost, and for a fleeting second he wondered what she would have said if she were here. He suspected she would have scolded him for hesitating. Evelyn lifted her phone again, typed a few words, then deleted them. She slid it face down on the table, as if refusing to grant it more power. When the waiter passed once more, she asked for the check. The words nearly broke her. She had ordered nothing but water, and now she would leave with nothing but shame. Still, she spoke them calmly, determined to hold the last shred of her dignity. From the corner, Nate felt a knot in his chest tighten. He saw Lila's wide eyes fixed on the young woman, her little hands clenched on her napkin. He recognized the plea forming even before she spoke it aloud. "Papa," she whispered, urgency edging her voice. "She needs us." The words struck like a stone thrown into still water, rippling through every guarded layer he had built around himself. He opened his mouth to answer, but found no sound would come. Lila tugged once more, and this time her voice carried beyond the table. "Dad, please, she needs us." A hush seemed to settle over their corner of the restaurant. Nate set his glass down slowly, staring at his daughter, then back at the lonely figure preparing to leave. The air between them thickened with unspoken questions. He had not planned to step into a stranger's sorrow tonight. He had intended only to feed his child, finish his meal, and return to the cold predictability of his home. Yet here he was, pressed by the innocent insistence of a little girl who still believed people could be rescued with nothing more than kindness. Evelyn reached for her purse, her hands trembling as she searched for the bills. The leather strap slipped, and the worn wallet inside tumbled onto the floor. She bent to pick it up, cheeks flushing scarlet, only to find that the flap had fallen open, revealing the thin stack of wrinkled dollar bills within. Her fingers moved quickly, embarrassed as she tried to shove them back in. But the glimpse had been enough to reveal the truth. This was not a woman who belonged easily in such a place. This was someone who had wagered the little she had on the hope of being wanted. Lila gasped softly, her eyes wide with compassion. Nate felt his defenses falter entirely. He could no longer tell himself this was none of his business. His daughter's gaze, so full of urgent innocence, had cornered him into recognizing the truth he wanted to ignore. There were moments in life when doing nothing was the same as cruelty. He could not walk away from this one. Evelyn rose from her chair, ready to slip into the night and let the laughter of strangers cover her shame. She had rehearsed in her mind the story she would tell herself later, that she had been strong enough to leave, that it had not mattered. But as she turned, A voice broke through the clatter of dishes and muted conversation. Soft, yet firm, carrying across the space with surprising clarity. "Miss," the waiter said gently, arriving at her side. "Your meal is ready." Her brows furrowed in confusion. She shook her head slightly. "But I didn't order anything." The man smiled politely. "It's already been taken care of." She blinked, uncertain if this was another cruel joke. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for the hidden laughter. None came. Only the warmth of the waiter's steady gaze and the faint aroma of pasta rising from the plate he placed before her. Evelyn's hands hovered above the table, too startled to sit back down. From across the room, Nate rose slowly from his chair. He adjusted his suit jacket, placed a steadying hand on Lila's shoulder, and began walking toward the young woman who stood torn between dignity and disbelief. Each step felt heavier than the last, yet lighter than any he had taken in years. And as Evelyn stared at the steaming plate before her, torn between suspicion and hunger, she realized the evening was not ending as she had expected. Something, or someone, was about to change the course of her night, and perhaps far more than that. Evelyn's hands hovered over the plate of pasta, the steam curling upward like a fragile promise. She wanted to protest, to say there must be some mistake, but the waiter had already stepped away, leaving her with the bewildering gift. The restaurant's quiet hum seemed to press against her ears. Every instinct told her to flee, yet something deeper urged her to stay. Pride wrestled with hunger, but more than either was the gnawing ache of loneliness. To sit alone in such a place had been punishment enough. To accept kindness, even if she did not trust it, felt like surrendering to a possibility she had nearly forgotten. She eased back into the chair, her pulse still hammering. The fork trembled in her fingers. When she tasted the first bite, a warmth spread through her chest that had little to do with food. For one moment she let herself close her eyes, as if maybe, just maybe, this night could still carry a measure of grace. At the other table, Nate slowed his approach, uncertain whether he was intruding. He had made countless speeches in boardrooms, negotiated contracts worth millions, yet his throat tightened now as if every word might betray him. Beside him, Lila clutched his hand, pulling him forward with the boldness only a child could have. She marched up to Evelyn's table and, without hesitation, spoke with innocent clarity. "Hi, you looked lonely. We thought you shouldn't eat by yourself." Evelyn froze, fork midair. Her eyes flicked from the little girl to the tall man standing just behind her. For an instant, she feared this was a continuation of the cruel joke, that laughter would erupt at her expense. But the girl's expression was earnest, her smile small but sincere. Evelyn set the fork down carefully, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's kind of you, but you don't even know me." Nate stepped forward then, his tone low and steady. "Sometimes that doesn't matter." He inclined his head politely, not demanding space but offering it. "May we sit with you?" The question landed like a pebble dropped into still water. Evelyn's instinct was to refuse, to protect what was left of her dignity. Yet the sincerity in the girl's eyes disarmed her defenses. She gestured faintly to the empty chair. "If you'd like." The waiter appeared again, almost as if he had been waiting for a signal. He guided Nate and Lila to seats, placing an extra set of silverware without comment. It was clear now. This was not charity paraded for the room's amusement. It was a quiet choice. A bridge extended across the space of her shame. Conversation at first came haltingly. Lila introduced herself with all the formality she could muster for a 7-year-old. "I'm Lila. This is my dad, Nate. He works too much, but he's nice when he remembers." The remark brought a small laugh from Evelyn despite herself. Nate coughed into his napkin, embarrassed but secretly grateful that his daughter had softened the air. Evelyn told them her name after a pause, the syllables shy on her lips. "Evelyn." She left it there, offering no details, no background. Yet she noticed the way Nate repeated it softly, as though storing it carefully. The sound of her name spoken without mockery felt like a balm. The meal unfolded slowly. Nate ordered a dish for himself and one for Lila, though he noticed Evelyn eating sparingly, as if unsure she deserved the plate before her. He kept the conversation gentle comments on the crispness of Vermont's autumn, the brilliance of the leaves that year, the charm of Burlington's streets when the shop fronts glowed at dusk. He did not pry, and for that Evelyn silently thanked him. She found herself responding in fragments, then in sentences, until she realized minutes had passed without the weight of shame crushing her chest. Still, doubt lingered. Why would a wealthy man and his daughter choose to sit with her, a stranger whose date had abandoned her? The suspicion flickered in her eyes, though she tried to hide it. Nate saw it nonetheless. He knew that look. He had carried it himself in the mirror since his wife's passing. It was the look of someone braced for disappointment, convinced that kindness could only be a prelude to loss. Lila, blissfully unaware of such shadows, chattered about her school art project and the pumpkin she had carved for the harvest festival. Evelyn listened, smiling at the child's enthusiasm. It struck her then how long it had been since she'd spoken to someone without the weight of pretense. For a few minutes, she forgot the empty messages on her phone, forgot the gnawing ache of rejection. She was simply a woman at dinner, sharing company she had not expected but perhaps needed. As the plates emptied and the room grew quieter, Nate leaned back slightly, studying the woman across from him. There was something familiar in her features, though he could not place it. Perhaps a trick of the light, or simply the echo of vulnerability that mirrored his own. He shook the thought aside, focusing instead on the way Lila beamed. His daughter had not smiled like this in months. That alone was reason enough to stay. The check arrived at last. Evelyn reached instinctively for her purse, determined not to be indebted. But Nate raised a hand gently. "It's taken care of," he said. His tone left little room for argument, though it carried no arrogance. "Consider it an evening shared." Evelyn hesitated. The part of her hardened by years of scrimping and saving screamed against accepting anything she hadn't earned. Yet the warmth in Lila's smile, the quiet steadiness in Nate's gaze, told her this was not pity. Reluctantly, she nodded. "Thank you." The words were soft, but they carried the weight of something she hadn't spoken in a long time. Trust. Outside, the October night greeted them with crisp air and the scent of fallen leaves. Cars passed slowly along the narrow street, headlights glinting off the damp pavement. Nate offered to walk her to her car, but Evelyn shook her head quickly. "I'll be fine." She did not mention that she had arrived on foot, unwilling to confess the distance she would walk back to her small apartment. She clutched her coat tighter, feeling the chill but also a strange flicker of warmth inside. Nate opened his mouth to insist, but before he could, Lila darted forward. She wrapped her small arms briefly around Evelyn's waist, a hug both awkward and sincere. "Good night," she said simply, then skipped back to her father's side. The gesture left Evelyn stunned. For a moment she stood frozen, her hand resting lightly where the child's arms had been, as though trying to hold on to the echo of affection. Nate gave her a nod, not pressing for more, and together he and his daughter walked toward their car. Evelyn watched them go, the glow of the street lamps softening their silhouettes. A whisper of longing stirred in her chest, a reminder of everything she had lost and everything she still yearned for. She turned toward the dark street that led home, her steps slow, her heart unsettled. The night air wrapped around Evelyn as she walked, her footsteps echoing softly on the quiet sidewalk. Burlington's downtown had begun to empty, most shops closed, though the glow of a late-night cafe spilled onto the street. She slowed near the window, drawn by the golden light inside where students hunched over laptops and couples leaned close over steaming mugs. For a fleeting second, she considered stepping in, prolonging the fragile warmth she had felt at the restaurant. But then she remembered the thin fold of bills in her wallet and shook her head. Coffee there cost more than she could spare. She turned toward the darker side streets that led to her small apartment above a laundromat. Climbing the narrow stairs, she felt the creak of each wooden step under her weight. The hallway smelled faintly of detergent and old paint. Unlocking her door, she slipped inside the single-room space that held her world. A second-hand couch, a thrift store desk stacked with textbooks, and a small bed tucked beneath the window. She set her purse on the counter and sank onto the couch, exhaling the breath she had held since leaving the restaurant. The quiet of the room pressed against her, harsher than the humiliation she had endured earlier. Loneliness had a sound all its own, and it filled the walls here. She pulled a blanket over her lap, trying to let the memory of pasta, candlelight, and a child's innocent hug soothe her. Across town, Nate eased his car into the driveway of his colonial-style house. The porch light cast a circle on the fallen leaves, and the faint smell of wood smoke drifted from a neighbor's chimney. Lila, drowsy from the late hour, clutched her stuffed rabbit as he lifted her from the back seat. She stirred only enough to murmur, "She was nice, Dad. Don't forget." He carried her inside, her words settling deep in his chest. Upstairs, after tucking her into bed, he stood in the doorway longer than usual, watching her breathe. There had been joy in her voice that evening, something he had not heard since his wife's laughter left the house silent. He whispered a good night and closed the door gently. In his study downstairs, the desk lamp lit neat piles of papers and a laptop screen blinking with unanswered emails. Nate loosened his tie and sat heavily in the chair. He tried to focus on the quarterly report, on the merger awaiting his signature, but his thoughts drifted back to the young woman at the restaurant, the way she had struggled to hide her pain, the stubborn pride that refused pity, yet softened at the kindness of a child. He rubbed his temples, unsettled by how vividly her face returned to him. She was a stranger, and yet not entirely. There was a familiarity in her expression that he could not name. For Evelyn, sleep came slowly. She lay in bed listening to the distant thrum of a dryer downstairs and the occasional car passing on the street. Images replayed in her mind. Trevor's cruel messages, the mocking absence across the table, then the unexpected kindness that followed. She could still feel the warmth of Lila's arms around her waist, brief yet real. She pressed a hand to her chest, as though the memory might slip away if she did not hold it tight. A strange thought came. What if this night, humiliating as it began, had planted something worth holding on to? She drifted at last into uneasy dreams, where candlelight flickered and voices mingled between ridicule and compassion. Days passed quietly, yet both Nate and Evelyn found themselves replaying the evening. For Evelyn, it lingered like an unexpected melody, soft and persistent. For Nate, it was a question he could not shake. Why had he cared enough to intervene? He told himself it was for Lila, to teach his daughter kindness. But in the privacy of his thoughts, he admitted it had been more than that. He had recognized something familiar in Evelyn's loneliness, something that mirrored his own. On a gray Thursday afternoon, Burlington's streets bustled with shoppers bundled in scarves, their breath puffing in the crisp air. Evelyn hurried from her shift at the university library, her bag heavy with borrowed textbooks. She turned onto a familiar corner, intending to duck into Speeder and Earl's coffee for a quick cup before class. The cafe's bell jingled as she stepped inside, greeted by the rich aroma of roasted beans and cinnamon. Students crowded the tables, laptops glowing, mugs steaming. She joined the line, counting her coins carefully. Enough for a small black coffee, nothing more. As she reached the counter, the barista smiled warmly. "What can I get for you?" Evelyn placed her change on the counter and asked softly for the cheapest option. The barista nodded, already turning to the machine, when another voice interjected, smooth and familiar. "Make it a double. With oat milk, please." Evelyn stiffened. She knew that voice. Slowly she turned, and there he was, Nate, seated near the corner with his laptop open. Tie loosened, sleeves rolled to his elbows. He looked up from his screen, eyes meeting hers with calm recognition. "Afternoon, Evelyn," he said, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Her first instinct was to protest, to refuse anything that might feel like charity. Yet the memory of Lila's hug softened her resistance. The barista slid the larger cup toward her, and Evelyn accepted it with hesitant fingers. She walked toward Nate's table, uncertain if she was intruding. But when he gestured to the empty chair, she found herself sitting before she could think twice. The chair felt too large beneath Evelyn as she sat across from Nate in the corner of Speeder and Earl's. She wrapped her hands around the warm cup, letting the steam rise into her face. She hadn't planned for this meeting, hadn't even wanted to be noticed. Yet here she was, staring at a man who seemed to carry both power and weariness in equal measure. His laptop screen glowed with spreadsheets, but he closed it with a decisive motion, as though her presence mattered more. "You didn't have to," she murmured, gesturing at the coffee. Her voice was soft, almost defensive. "I can pay for myself." Nate leaned back, hands folded loosely. "I know. That's not the point." His tone carried no arrogance, no hint of superiority, only quiet steadiness. "Sometimes we all need a little help staying warm." He sipped his own coffee, eyes lingering on her face as though he wanted to read the thoughts she tried so hard to hide. Evelyn pressed her lips together, uncertain how to respond. For years she had trained herself to accept nothing she hadn't earned. to expect disappointment before kindness. Trusting came hard. Yet something about his composure, the absence of pity in his gaze, unsettled her defenses. She looked away, studying the cafe walls adorned with local art, the chalkboard listing pumpkin spice specials. Students bustled past with backpacks and earbuds, the world moving on without noticing her hesitation. Then a small shadow fell across the table. Lila appeared, cheeks pink from the cold, her school backpack slung over one shoulder. She spotted Evelyn and broke into a grin. "You're here," she exclaimed, climbing onto the empty chair beside her father. Without waiting for permission, she tugged a sketchbook from her bag and flipped it open to a drawing of a house with smoke curling from the chimney. 3 stick figures stood outside, holding hands beneath a smiling Sunday. "I drew this in art class," she announced proudly. "It's me and Dad, but I think it needs someone else." Evelyn blinked, touched by the innocent declaration. "It's beautiful," she said, tracing the lines with her eyes. "You're very talented." "Em?" Lila beamed, as if the praise were treasure. Nate ruffled his daughter's hair, though his gaze flickered briefly to Evelyn. The unspoken message lingered. His child had already accepted this stranger into her imagination. They talked a little more light subjects, the kind that slipped easily from a child's lips. Lila described her favorite teacher, her dislike of cafeteria peas, her excitement for the upcoming harvest festival. Evelyn listened with genuine interest, nodding, asking gentle questions. Each answer reminded her of the childhood she had longed for, one filled with stability and encouragement instead of constant scraping by. She stole glances at Nate, noting how he listened intently, how his stern features softened when Lila spoke. There was love there, deep and unyielding, though shadowed by loss. As the minutes passed, Evelyn began to relax. She laughed once, surprised by the sound. Nate noticed and allowed himself the faintest smile. It had been a long time since he had heard laughter in his company that wasn't forced by social obligation. Something about the ordinary setting a cafe, a cup of coffee, a child's sketchbook felt more healing than any grand gesture could. Eventually, Evelyn glanced at her watch and jolted. "I have class," she said, gathering her things quickly. She hesitated, not wanting to appear ungrateful. "Thank you for the coffee and the company." She directed the last words at Lila, who hugged her sketchbook to her chest, eyes shining. Nate inclined his head. "Anytime." He didn't press for more, didn't demand promises. But as Evelyn hurried toward the door, the bell chiming overhead, he watched with a thoughtful expression. Lila, still coloring in her drawing, whispered without looking up, "She should come to the festival with us." Nate did not answer immediately. Instead, he sipped his coffee, letting the warmth settle against the chill that had crept into his life for too long. Outside, Evelyn walked quickly across the street, her bag bumping against her hip. The wind carried the sharp scent of fallen leaves and distant chimney smoke. She tried to dismiss the tug in her chest, the faint longing stirred by a child's simple acceptance. Yet the image of that drawing 2 stick figures waiting for a third clung to her. For the first time in months, she wondered what it would feel like to belong somewhere. That evening, back in her small apartment, Evelyn pulled out her textbooks but found her focus wandering. She replayed every moment. Lila's grin, Nate's calm voice, the coffee warming her hands. The memories spilled into her dreams, where she stood in a sunlit yard beside a child who called her family. Saturday morning arrived with a brisk chill, the kind that carried the promise of winter in the edges of autumn. Burlington's streets were alive, with families carrying pumpkins and bags of apples from the farmer's market. Evelyn stepped out of the library where she had finished a short shift. Her coat buttoned tight, her bag heavy with notes and borrowed books. She considered heading straight home, but the music drifting from the town square tugged at her. A fiddler played near the fountain, drawing a small crowd. Curious, she wandered closer, drawn to the warmth of community she rarely let herself enjoy. The square bustled with the preparations for the harvest festival. Stalls sold caramel apples, cider donuts, and knitted scarves in bright colors. Children ran in circles, clutching balloons. Evelyn let herself stroll among them, inhaling the sweet scent of kettle corn, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. She paused at a booth, offering face painting, smiling at the sight of little ones, leaving with pumpkins and leaves painted on their cheeks. Then she heard a familiar laugh, bright, unmistakable. Turning, she spotted Lila weaving through the crowd, her blue coat flapping, her father just a step behind. The girl's eyes lit when she saw Evelyn, and she ran forward without hesitation. "You came!" she cried, grabbing Evelyn's hand. "You have to see the hayride!" Evelyn's breath caught. She hadn't intended to meet them here, hadn't planned anything at all. Yet the sheer joy in the child's welcome dissolved her reservations. She smiled, squeezing Lila's small fingers. "Show me then." Nate approached more slowly, his hands in his coat pockets, expression guarded yet not unfriendly. "Good to see you again," he said simply. His eyes searched hers, as though measuring whether she regretted their last meeting. Evelyn nodded, answering with quiet sincerity. "You too." The three of them walked together through the square. Lila chattered about her school project, about how she hoped to win a ribbon in the pumpkin carving contest. Evelyn listened, her laughter coming more easily now. Nate bought them hot cider, pressing the warm cups into their hands. Evelyn tried to protest, but he silenced her gently. "Consider it my daughter's request." She sipped, savoring the sweetness that lingered on her tongue. Later, as they rode the hay wagon through the golden fields on the edge of town, Evelyn found herself between Nate and Lila, the straw rustling beneath them, the horizon glowing with late afternoon Sunday. Lila leaned against her side, content, while Nate's arm rested lightly along the back of the bench. Not quite touching her, but close enough to feel present, Evelyn gazed across the fields, her heart stirring with emotions she could scarcely name. It felt as if she were being stitched back into a fabric she thought she had lost forever. When the ride ended, they walked back toward the square together. Lila tugged at Evelyn's hand again. "Will you come to the bonfire tonight? There'll be music and marshmallows." The invitation hung in the air, sweet and fragile. Evelyn hesitated, glancing at Nate. He gave a small shrug, his eyes steady on hers. "It's up to you," he said softly. "No expectations." She considered the long walk back to her apartment, the pile of textbooks waiting on her desk. But then she looked at Lila's hopeful face, at the glow of lanterns being strung across the square. Something inside her whispered that life could not always be measured in coins and caution. Sometimes it had to be taken in moments. She smiled. "Maybe I will." That evening, when the fire crackled high and sparks danced into the dark sky, Evelyn stood among the townsfolk with Nate and Lila by her side. The warmth of the flames painted their faces in shifting gold. Children roasted marshmallows, fiddlers played lively tunes, and neighbors clapped in rhythm. Evelyn felt herself absorbed into the heartbeat of the community, as if she belonged. She watched Lila laugh and Nate smile, and for the first time in a very long time, she believed the night might hold more than survival. It might hold the beginnings of something she had almost forgotten: family. Yet, as the fire burned lower and the crowd began to drift away, a quiet unease settled in her chest. Happiness felt fragile, like glass that could shatter with one wrong move. She had opened herself to their company, but could she truly belong in their world? The question lingered, unanswered, as she walked home with the taste of smoke and cider still clinging to her. Sunday morning dawned gray and cool, the kind of Vermont morning when mist clung low over Lake Champlain and the church bells carried further in the still air. Evelyn rose early, unable to sleep after the night at the festival. She stood by her window with a mug of tea, watching the town stir awake. The echo of Lila's laughter, the glow of the bonfire, the faint press of Nate's presence beside her all replayed in her mind with startling clarity. It felt as though she had slipped into a dream where loneliness loosened its grip. Yet she reminded herself sternly, dreams rarely lasted. She spent the morning catching up on her nursing coursework, flipping through pages of anatomy notes. But her thoughts drifted constantly. She wondered if Lila had won the pumpkin carving ribbon, if Nate had stayed to chat with neighbors at the bonfire. She scolded herself for caring, for allowing her heart to open even a crack. Life had taught her that openings led to wounds. Still, a quiet hope pulsed beneath her caution, a hope she couldn't smother. That afternoon, her phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number. "Thank you for last night. Lila hasn't stopped talking about the hayride, Nate." Evelyn stared at the screen, her heart skipping. She typed a reply, deleted it, then typed again. Finally, she sent a simple line. "She's a wonderful girl. I enjoyed her company." Almost instantly, another message appeared. "We're headed to Waterfront Park for a walk before dinner. You're welcome to join if you'd like." Evelyn sat frozen, the choice heavy before her. The sensible answer was no. The answer her heart wanted whispered yes. She found herself walking toward the lake an hour later, scarf wrapped snugly, boots crunching over the last of the fallen leaves. The waterfront spread out before her, sailboats rocking gently against the docks, gulls circling above. Children skipped stones near the shore while joggers passed with headphones. And there, near the benches overlooking the water, stood Nate and Lila. Lila spotted her first, squealing with delight as she ran forward. "You came! I told Dad you would!" The hug she threw around Evelyn's waist warmed more than the thickest coat. Nate greeted her with a nod, his smile small but genuine. "Glad you could make it." They strolled along the path, Lila skipping ahead, pointing at ducks and tugging at her father's hand. The three of them fell into step, a rhythm that felt natural, almost practiced. Evelyn found herself laughing at Lila's stories, sharing bits about her own childhood, how she used to read by flashlight under the covers, how she once tried to bake cookies and nearly set the oven aflame. Nate chuckled at the image, shaking his head. "Sounds like something Lila might try." They stopped at a vendor selling hot chocolate. Nate ordered 3, handing one to Evelyn without question. She hesitated only a second before accepting, the warmth seeping into her chilled fingers. They sat on a bench facing the lake, steam rising from their cups. Lila perched between them, humming a tune, occasionally leaning against Evelyn, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Evelyn's chest tightened at the trust so freely given. She glanced at Nate, who watched the horizon with a pensive expression. For a moment, she wondered what he saw there. Memories, regrets, hopes yet unspoken. As the afternoon light faded into the pinks and golds of early evening, Lila grew sleepy, her head resting on Evelyn's shoulder. Evelyn froze, then softened, letting the child nestle closer. Nate watched silently, his eyes shadowed with something she couldn't name. Gratitude, perhaps, or longing. The moment stretched, delicate and fragile, until Lila stirred and whispered, "Can we have dinner together?" Evelyn's heart thudded. She looked to Nate, uncertain, but he only nodded. "There's a diner not far from here," he said. "Simple food, nothing fancy." The diner was a classic American place, its neon sign buzzing faintly in the twilight. Inside, the scent of frying bacon mingled with the sweetness of pie cooling on the counter. Red vinyl booths lined the walls, and a jukebox in the corner played a soft tune from another decade. Families filled the tables, children sharing milkshakes, older couples lingering over coffee. Evelyn felt out of place at first, but when Lila grabbed her hand and pulled her toward a booth, the unease melted slightly. They slid into the booth together, Lila on one side, Nate and Evelyn opposite. Menus were sticky with fingerprints, but the comfort of the place was undeniable. Nate ordered a turkey club, Lila a grilled cheese with fries, and Evelyn hesitated before settling on a simple bowl of chicken soup. The waitress, a woman with a warm smile and a quick pencil, topped off their water glasses and winked at Lila. "Big night out?" she teased. Lila giggled and nodded, clearly delighted. While they waited for their food, conversation flowed more easily than Evelyn had expected. Lila carried most of it, telling them about her favorite books, her Halloween costume plans, and the neighbor's cat that always tried to sneak into their yard. Evelyn added small stories of her own about long walks by the lake, about the tiny victories of passing exams, about her mother's recipe for apple crisp. Nate listened, his gaze steady, his occasional questions gentle. He spoke of his work only briefly, as though aware it was not the heart of the evening. Instead, he asked about her classes, her dreams for the future. At one point, Evelyn admitted shyly, "I've always wanted to work in pediatrics. Kids remind me why the hard work matters." She glanced down, embarrassed by the confession, but Nate's expression softened. "That makes sense," he said simply. "You have a way with children." His eyes flicked toward Lila, who had leaned against Evelyn as though she had known her forever. The food arrived hot and comforting. They ate slowly, savoring not just the flavors, but the sense of ease that had crept into their booth. Evelyn couldn't remember the last time she had shared a meal that felt like more than necessity. For years, she had eaten quickly, alone, moving from one obligation to the next. Tonight, time seemed to pause. She caught herself smiling at Lila's ketchup-smeared grin, at Nate's dry humor when the waitress teased him for ordering black coffee after dark. For the first time, She felt the ache of loneliness ease under the simple act of belonging. After dinner, they lingered over slices of pie pumpkin for Lila, apple for Evelyn, pecan for Nate. The jukebox played a slow tune, and the light above their booth cast everything in a warm glow. Nate leaned back, watching Evelyn laugh at something Lila said, and for a moment he allowed himself to imagine what it would be like if evenings like this were not rare, but routine. The thought unsettled him as much as it comforted him. When the check arrived, Evelyn reached for her purse, determined to pay for her soup and pie. But Nate's hand was already there, sliding the leather folder toward himself. "It's on me," he said firmly. Evelyn bristled. "I can't keep letting you," he interrupted gently, his voice low. "It's not about what you let me do. It's about what we share." The words lingered between them, heavy with meaning, before Evelyn nodded reluctantly, unable to argue. Outside, the night had deepened. The street lamps glowed, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. The three of them walked slowly toward the parking lot, Lila skipping ahead, her breath visible in the cool air. At the car, Lila turned and hugged Evelyn tightly, her small arms squeezing with all her strength. "You have to come again," she declared. Evelyn knelt, hugging her back, whispering, "I'd like that." Nate watched the exchange, his expression unreadable, though his eyes shone faintly in the light. When Evelyn straightened, he cleared his throat. "Thank you for joining us. It meant a lot to her." His voice dropped. "And to me." Evelyn met his gaze, feeling the weight of his sincerity. She wanted to speak, to confess that it had meant just as much to her, but the words tangled in her throat. Instead, she smiled faintly, pulling her scarf tighter. As she walked away into the night, her heart pounded with confusion and hope. She had stepped into their world for an evening, tasted the warmth of family she had long believed beyond her reach. Yet fear whispered at the edges, fear of loss, of rejection, of daring to want more. Still, as she turned the corner, she couldn't stop herself from smiling. Somewhere deep inside, she sensed that this was not the end of their story. It was only the beginning. The week after the Harvest Festival passed in a blur of routine. Evelyn buried herself in classes and long shifts at the university library, but the memory of the diner lingered like the scent of cinnamon that clung to her scarf. At odd moments, waiting in line at the grocery store, walking across campus in the chill wind, she found herself replaying the sound of Lila's giggles, the quiet steadiness in Nate's voice, the warmth of being welcomed into something that felt perilously close to family. One evening, after a long day of studying, she returned to her apartment to find a voicemail blinking on her phone. The message was short, Nate's voice taut and unfamiliar. "Evelyn, I'm sorry to bother you, but Lila isn't well. She's running a high fever and I don't know what else to do. She keeps asking for you. Could you come?" Her heart lurched. She grabbed her coat without hesitation, barely pausing to lock the door. The streets blurred as she hurried toward the Whitmore home. A stately house with white columns and wide porches that felt as imposing as its owner's reputation. But tonight the lights burned late, shadows pacing behind the curtains. Evelyn rang the bell once before Nate opened the door almost immediately, his tie loose, his eyes ringed with worry. "Thank you for coming," he said, voice rougher than she had ever heard it. He stepped aside, and she entered into the hush of a house that had been holding its breath. The air smelled faintly of medicine and lemon cleaner. On the couch in the living room, Lila lay curled beneath a quilt, her cheeks flushed scarlet, her eyes glassy. "Ev," the girl whispered, lifting a weak hand. Evelyn dropped her bag and hurried to her side, kneeling beside the couch. She pressed her palm gently to Lila's forehead and winced at the heat radiating from her skin. "It's all right, sweetheart," she murmured. "We'll make you feel better." From the doorway, Nate watched, arms folded tightly, as though to hold himself together. He had called doctors, given medicine, but nothing had eased his daughter's fever. Seeing Evelyn slip so easily into the space beside Lila filled him with both relief and bewilderment. He was not accustomed to needing help, and certainly not from a woman who had been a stranger only weeks ago. Yet when Lila clung to Evelyn's hand, whispering for her not to leave, Nate understood why he had made the call. Evelyn pulled a small pouch from her bag. "I learned this during my hospital training," she explained, holding up a bundle of herbs wrapped in cloth. "Lavender and mint. It helps draw down fever." She soaked it in cool water from the kitchen, wrung it out, and placed it gently across Lila's forehead. The child sighed, her breathing easing slightly. Evelyn began to hum softly, almost without thinking, a lullaby her mother had sung long ago. The tune was simple, about the moon wearing socks to keep warm, half lullaby and half nonsense. But the moment the melody filled the room, Nate stiffened. He knew that song. His late wife had invented it during sleepless nights when Lila was a baby, pacing the floor with her in her arms. It was not a song anyone else should have known. Hearing it now, in Evelyn's trembling voice, sent a shock through him so strong that he staggered back into the doorway. He pressed a hand to his face, struggling to contain the flood of memories. Evelyn continued humming, her hand stroking Lila's hair until the girl's eyelids fluttered and finally closed. Her breathing steadied, the fever easing just enough to grant her rest. Evelyn adjusted the quilt carefully, then looked up, startled to see Nate sitting heavily in a nearby chair, his face buried in his hands. Nate's shoulders shook, the sound of his muffled sobs filling the quiet room. It startled Evelyn. She had only ever known him as composed, guarded, the man who seemed untouched by anything. Now he looked fragile, undone, like a dam finally cracking after years of strain. She hesitated, unsure if approaching him would cross an unseen boundary. But then Lila stirred slightly in her sleep, and Evelyn realized that boundaries no longer mattered. Not tonight. She rose from the couch and moved toward him. "Nate," she said softly, her voice carrying the kind of steadiness she wished she felt herself. He lifted his face, and the sight of his red-rimmed eyes made her chest tighten. "That song!" His voice broke again. "I haven't heard it since my wife. Since Eleanor." He couldn't finish. Evelyn placed a tentative hand on his arm. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you. It was just something I remembered from. I don't even know where. My mother used to hum it sometimes, or something very close." She shook her head. "I thought it might help." Nate studied her, disbelief warring with gratitude in his eyes. The coincidence was too sharp, too piercing. It felt like fate playing tricks, bringing a stranger into his home to sing the exact lullaby that once belonged to his family alone. But beyond the mystery, there was the undeniable truth. Lila had calmed under Evelyn's voice, and for the first time in days, Nate felt less alone in his grief. He drew a shaky breath. "You don't know what that meant. I thought Lila had forgotten. I thought I was the only one who remembered. And even then, I couldn't bear to sing it." His gaze dropped to the floor, ashamed of his own weakness. "You reminded her and me that love doesn't disappear. It lingers." For a long moment, they sat in silence, Evelyn's hand resting lightly on his sleeve. She felt the weight of his sorrow, the cracks in his armor. She had her own scars, her own quiet loneliness, but tonight she was steady for both of them. "Nate," she said gently, "you don't have to carry this alone. Lila doesn't need you to be perfect. She just needs you to be here. And sometimes, she'll need others too." Her words sank into him like rain into parched earth. He had built his life around control, around being the one who never faltered. Yet here was Evelyn, reminding him that his daughter's healing and his own could come from opening the door, not barring it shut. When he finally spoke, his voice was steadier. "Thank you for coming. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't answered." Evelyn gave a faint smile. "I think you would have managed, but it's nice to know you don't always have to." She glanced toward the couch, where Lila slept peacefully, her small hand still curled around the edge of the quilt. "She's strong, Nate, stronger than either of us know." Nate followed her gaze, and a softer expression crossed his features. He reached out, almost unconsciously, and laid his hand over Evelyn's. The gesture was brief, but it carried 1,000 unspoken things: gratitude, trust, maybe even the fragile beginnings of something neither dared name. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 11, breaking the moment. Evelyn withdrew her hand gently. "I'll stay until she's through the night," she offered. "Just in case the fever spikes again." He nodded, relief flickering in his eyes. "If you're sure." So they settled into a quiet vigil. Nate dozed lightly in the chair, waking at every small sound. Evelyn remained by Lila's side, humming softly now and then, refreshing the compress, smoothing her hair. The hours stretched long, but the silence between them was no longer heavy. It was the silence of shared purpose, of two people tethered by the fragile thread of a child's well-being. Near dawn, when the first light touched the curtains, Lila stirred again. Her fever had broken, her cheeks cool, and her breathing even. She blinked up at Evelyn and whispered hoarsely, "You stayed." Evelyn smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "Of course I did. You're too important to me to leave." From the chair, Nate watched the exchange, something swelling painfully in his chest. It was not just gratitude anymore. It was recognition of how much Evelyn had already come to mean, of how she had stepped into a place he hadn't known was vacant. A part of him trembled at the thought, but another part, the part that had sung lullabies once upon a time, finally dared to hope. The morning after Lila's fever broke, the Whitmore house carried a hush that felt different from the night before. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, spilling across the polished wooden floors. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee cupped between her hands. She hadn't meant to stay so long, but Nate insisted she eat breakfast before leaving. Lila, still pale but smiling, padded in wearing her fuzzy socks and perched beside her father, leaning sleepily against his arm. "You stayed all night," Nate said quietly, setting a plate of toast in front of Evelyn. His voice carried neither embarrassment nor apology, only a quiet gratitude that caught her off guard. "I don't think I've ever seen her that calm when she was sick." "You did that." Evelyn lowered her eyes, tracing the rim of her mug. "She just needed someone close. Kids, they know when they're not alone." She paused, then added softly, "We all do." The remark hung between them, heavier than intended. Nate studied her, as though trying to decide if she was speaking for Lila or for herself. Before he could reply, Lila piped up with a blunt innocence only a child could carry. "Daddy, can Evelyn come over more? I like when she's here. The house isn't so quiet." Nate's expression softened, but he gave his daughter a half smile. "We'll see, sweetheart. She has her own life, too." Yet his eyes lingered on Evelyn, a silent question he wasn't ready to voice. Later that day, Evelyn returned to her small apartment on the edge of town. The space felt colder, lonelier, after the warmth of the Whitmore home. She set her keys on the counter and noticed the envelope sitting where she had left it days earlier. The scholarship letter. Oregon. A full year away. A chance to build the future she had fought for through years of night shifts and secondhand textbooks. She unfolded the letter again, her eyes tracing the lines she already knew by heart. "Congratulations. Awarded. Full tuition, living stipend." She should have been overjoyed. Instead, her chest ached with the weight of what accepting it would mean, leaving behind the fragile bond forming with Lila and the unspoken tether to Nate. At the library that evening, she tried to focus on her work, but her mind wandered back to the sound of Lila's small voice whispering, "You stayed." The words replayed in her head, pulling her deeper into conflict. She wanted to believe she could have both, her career and this unexpected thread of family. But reality was sharper. Life rarely granted both dreams at once. Meanwhile, Nate wrestled with his own turmoil. In his office at Whitmore Industries, he sat staring at a spreadsheet he couldn't read. Numbers blurred into meaningless lines as his mind replayed Evelyn's lullaby, her steady presence at Lila's bedside. He had spent years burying grief beneath work, convincing himself he needed no one. But one night had unraveled all of it. Now he couldn't stop asking himself, was he ready to let someone new step into their lives? More frightening still, was he ready to admit how much he wanted her to? The weekend arrived with crisp October air and the buzz of a fall craft fair downtown. Stalls lined the main street, overflowing with pumpkins, apple pies, knitted scarves. Evelyn wandered through the crowd, clutching a paper cup of cider, trying to lose herself in the noise. But a familiar voice called her name, and she turned to see Nate and Lila weaving through the crowd. Lila ran straight into her arms, giggling. "We found you!" she exclaimed. Evelyn laughed, though her heart stuttered at the sight of Nate, smiling more freely than she had ever seen. They strolled together past the booths, sampling caramel apples, listening to a bluegrass band playing near the courthouse steps. For a few hours, it was easy to forget the letter waiting in her apartment drawer. Easy to imagine this was her place walking beside them, hand in hand with a child who looked at her like she belonged. But as the sun dipped low and the lights strung above Main Street began to glow, reality crept back. Evelyn knew she couldn't keep pretending forever. A choice loomed, and it would cut one world away from the other. That night after the fair, Evelyn returned home with the scent of roasted chestnuts still clinging to her coat. She set the empty cider cup on the counter, then pulled open the drawer where the scholarship letter waited like a secret she no longer had the luxury to ignore. Her fingers lingered on the envelope, her chest heavy. For days, she had hidden from the decision, burying it beneath moments with Lila and sidelong glances from Nate. But she knew she couldn't keep silent forever. The following afternoon, Nate invited her over under the pretense of helping Lila carve pumpkins. The girl beamed when Evelyn arrived, dragging her straight to the kitchen table already spread with newspapers and knives. For an hour, the room filled with laughter, pumpkin guts flying, seeds sticking to their sleeves, Nate pretending to gag dramatically while Evelyn scolded him with a smile. It was messy, imperfect, alive. For Evelyn, it felt like the kind of memory families built without even realizing it. When the pumpkins were lit and glowing on the porch, Lila dozed off on the couch, her head heavy on her father's shoulder. Nate carefully shifted her onto a pillow and tucked a blanket around her. Then he turned back to Evelyn, his expression soft but serious. "She hasn't stopped talking about you," he said quietly. "I don't know how you did it, but you've become a part of her world and mine." Evelyn's throat tightened. She had rehearsed this moment in her head, but standing in the glow of the carved pumpkins, with Lila breathing softly in the next room, the words felt like betrayal. Still, she forced them out. "Nate, there's something I need to tell you. I was awarded a scholarship in Oregon. It's a full year of training. It starts this August." His face stilled, the warmth draining as the weight of her words sank in. "Oregon," he repeated, as though testing the distance on his tongue. "That's far, and Visti." "I know." She twisted her hands in her lap. "It's everything I've worked for, but it means leaving. Leaving here. Leaving—" Her voice faltered. She couldn't finish. Nate stepped back, running a hand through his hair. He had spent weeks slowly letting himself believe in the possibility of her presence, of her laughter filling rooms that had grown too quiet. Now the ground shifted again, threatening to take it all away. "So whatever we've started, it has an expiration date?" Evelyn's eyes burned. "I don't want it to, but I can't just throw this away. It's a chance to build a future, to help kids like Lila, kids who need more than I ever had." Her voice broke. "But the thought of walking away from her, from you—" The silence stretched, heavy with everything they couldn't yet say. Nate wanted to tell her to stay, to beg her not to go. But another voice, quieter yet truer, reminded him that love wasn't about possession. It was about giving wings. He looked at her, torn between desperation and respect. Finally, he said, "You have to follow this, even if it hurts. You earned it." Evelyn blinked at him, startled by the steadiness in his tone. He was breaking inside, she could see it in his eyes, but he was still choosing what was right for her over what was easy for him. And somehow, that made the ache sharper. From the couch, Lila stirred, murmuring Evelyn's name in her sleep. The sound sliced through the air, tender and devastating all at once. Evelyn leaned forward, brushing a tear from her cheek. "I'll find a way to tell her, but not tonight." Nate nodded slowly, his jaw tight. "Not tonight," he echoed. Then, softer, "Stay a little longer, just until she wakes. She'll want to see you, and free." So Evelyn stayed, watching the glow of the pumpkins flicker against the window panes, knowing each passing hour brought her closer to the moment when she would have to decide dream or family, wings or roots. And for the first time in her life, she wished she didn't have to choose. The days after Evelyn's confession passed like a dream, half remembered. She still saw Nate and Lila study breaks at the library, shared dinners at the diner, but now each moment carried a fragile edge. Every smile felt like it might be the last. Every laugh softened by the knowledge of what August would bring. Evelyn tried to bury her turmoil beneath small joys, but at night the scholarship letter glowed in her mind like a neon sign, impossible to ignore. Nate kept his composure, at least on the surface. At the office, he was as sharp as ever, his colleagues none the wiser. But at home, he found himself staring at Evelyn's scarf left behind on a chair, or at Lila's new drawings taped to the fridge, each one featuring 3 stick figures instead of 2. He knew what it meant. He knew what Lila already felt, and he dreaded the day he would have to tell her that Evelyn might be gone. One chilly Saturday, Evelyn joined them for a walk through Greenwood Park. The trees were bare now, their branches etched against the pale winter sky. Lila skipped ahead, her boots crunching through the leaves. She held Evelyn's hand one moment, Nate's the next, pulling them both along as though she could tether them together by sheer will. Evelyn laughed, but when she glanced at Nate, she caught the shadow in his eyes. He was watching her with a look that seemed both hopeful and resigned. They stopped at the pond, where a group of children fed breadcrumbs to ducks. Lila pressed closer to Evelyn and said quietly, "When you go back to your school, will you still visit me?" Her voice was so small, so uncertain, that Evelyn's chest ached. She crouched down, looking into those wide brown eyes. "Sweetheart, I'm not going anywhere right now. I'll be here as long as I can." "But Daddy said Oregon is far." Lila's lip trembled. "That means you can't come for sleepovers or pumpkin carving. And who will sing the moon song if you're gone?" The words hit Evelyn harder than she expected. She blinked quickly, forcing her tears back. "Lila, no matter where I am, you'll still have me here." She pressed a hand gently over the girl's heart. "Songs don't disappear, remember? They stay inside us." Lila tried to smile, but her eyes were glossy. She threw her arms around Evelyn's neck, clinging fiercely. Evelyn held her tight, her gaze lifting to meet Nate's across the pond. His face was pale, his jaw clenched, as if holding back the same tide of emotion threatening to break inside her. That evening, after dropping Lila at a friend's birthday party, Nate drove Evelyn home. The car ride was heavy with silence, the kind that fills every corner no matter how you shift in your seat. Finally, Nate spoke, his voice low. "She's already attached to you. I don't know how I'm supposed to tell her that you might leave." Evelyn stared out the window, watching the blur of holiday lights strung across porches. "I don't know how I'm supposed to tell her either." Her voice cracked. "Nate, I want this scholarship. I fought so hard for it, but I also want—" She trailed off, afraid of saying the words aloud. Nate gripped the steering wheel tighter. "You want a family," he finished for her. His voice was not accusing, only unbearably gentle. "And so do I. But life doesn't always give us both dreams at once." They pulled up to her building, neither moving, to get out. For a long moment, they just sat there, the hum of the engine filling the silence. Evelyn finally turned, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Tell me what I should do." Nate's chest ached with the weight of it. He wanted to say, "Stay, choose us." But instead he shook his head. "I can't make that choice for you. All I can do is tell you this. Whatever you decide, you've already changed us. You've changed me." The following week, Evelyn tried to throw herself back into her studies, but focus slipped through her fingers. She lingered longer at the Whitmore house, helping Lila with homework, baking cookies in the big kitchen that once felt intimidating but now felt almost like home. Every time she left, Lila clung to her side, whispering, "Promise you'll come back tomorrow." And every time, Evelyn promised, even as her chest tightened at the thought that one day soon, she might not be able to keep it. One evening, Evelyn stopped by with a stack of children's books she had borrowed from the library. Lila squealed with delight and insisted they read together on the couch. Nate watched from the doorway as Evelyn's voice filled the room, gentle and melodic, carrying the rhythm of the story. Lila nestled close, her head against Evelyn's shoulder. It was a picture Nate hadn't seen since Eleanor was alive. A family framed by lamplight, laughter, and the warmth of shared presence. But the image also tore at him. When Evelyn finally looked up, their eyes met across the room. He saw the same conflict mirrored there, yearning and fear, hope and inevitability. He excused himself to the kitchen, unable to bear it. Evelyn followed a few minutes later, finding him staring out the window at the darkened lawn. "She belongs to you," Evelyn said softly, leaning against the doorframe. "I don't want to confuse her. Or hurt her." "You're not confusing her," Nate replied, his voice raw. "You're giving her something I couldn't, someone who makes her feel like her mother is still close. That matters more than you know." Evelyn swallowed hard. "But if I leave?" Nate turned to her, his expression unguarded at last. "If you leave, she'll be heartbroken, and so will I. But if you stay only out of obligation, we'll lose you anyway." His hand twitched at his side, as if he wanted to reach for hers but couldn't quite cross the line. "I don't want your sacrifice. I want your choice." The words carved themselves into her heart. She didn't answer, couldn't. Instead, she nodded faintly and returned to Lila's side, where the child had already drifted into sleep with the open book sliding from her lap. Evelyn tucked a blanket around her and sat quietly, listening to the sound of Lila's breathing, steady and innocent. Later that night, as Evelyn prepared to leave, Lila stirred awake and caught her hand. "You smell like Mama," the girl murmured. The same words she had spoken weeks earlier at the park. They pierced Evelyn's chest, leaving her frozen. Nate, standing behind her, stiffened too, his face shadowed with memory. Lila's grip tightened. "Don't go away, Evelyn. Please." "Oh?" Tears blurred Evelyn's vision. She bent down and pressed a kiss to the girl's hair. "I'll always be with you," she whispered. But even as she said it, she felt the hollowness of promises she might not be able to keep. Outside on the porch, Nate followed her into the cold night. The air smelled of pine and distant wood smoke, the quiet of the neighborhood wrapping around them. "She sees you as family," he said, his voice low, almost breaking. "And maybe she's not wrong." Evelyn hugged her coat tighter, shivering not from the cold but from the weight of his words. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to be what she needs. What you both need. You already are," Nate answered simply. The honesty in his tone undid her. He looked at her for a long moment, then added, "The only question left is whether you'll let yourself believe it." Evelyn turned away, her throat burning, her heart torn between two futures. One glittered with professional triumph, the other pulsed with the fragile, terrifying beauty of family. And as she walked down the steps into the night, she realized she couldn't delay the decision much longer. The storm inside her was reaching its peak. The final weeks of winter blurred into spring. Buds appeared on the trees lining Maple Street, and the air carried the faint promise of renewal. But inside Evelyn's chest, the storm still raged. Her scholarship deadline loomed closer. Each day she delayed her response. Each day she lingered longer at the Whitmore home, made the choice feel heavier. One Saturday morning, she walked with Nate and Lila through the farmer's market downtown. Booths overflowed with fresh strawberries and jars of honey, the air alive with chatter, and the sound of a fiddler playing near the courthouse steps. Lila tugged at Evelyn's hand, dragging her to a stall where a local artist painted children's names onto wooden signs. The girl insisted on 3 names carved together: Nate, Lila, Evelyn. When the sign was finished, Lila hugged it proudly to her chest. "Now we'll always be together," she announced. Evelyn's breath caught, and she glanced at Nate, whose expression was caught between tenderness and fear. That evening, Evelyn sat alone at her apartment table, the scholarship letter spread out before her. The ink no longer gleamed with promise. Instead, it weighed like an anchor, pulling her in 2 directions. She closed her eyes and remembered Lila's small hand gripping hers, Nate's voice cracking as he admitted she had already changed him. She wanted to chase her dream, but dreams shifted. What once looked like freedom now looked like distance, an ocean between her and the fragile family she had stumbled into. The decision came quietly, not with fireworks, but with a steady calm. She picked up her pen, and with a trembling hand, she wrote her response. It wasn't what the world might expect, but it was what her heart demanded. The next day, she returned to the Whitmore house. Lila was on the porch swing, clutching the wooden sign, her feet kicking the boards. When she saw Evelyn, she leapt up and ran straight into her arms. "You came back!" she cried, as though she had feared she wouldn't. "I'll always come back," Evelyn whispered, holding her tight. Inside, Nate stood waiting. His expression was unreadable, wary, as though bracing for goodbye. Evelyn took a deep breath, her hands shaking. "I sent my letter," she said. "I turned down Oregon." For a moment, silence reigned. Nate blinked, stunned. "You... what?" "I couldn't leave her. I couldn't leave you." Evelyn's voice broke, but she pressed on.
"Maybe I'll never be the kind of success the world measures with degrees and titles.
"But I want to be the kind of success Lila measures with bedtime stories and pumpkin carving. I want to build something real, right here." Nate's breath shuddered out of him, relief and awe mingling in his eyes. "Evelyn, you don't know what this means." "Yes, I do." She smiled faintly through tears. "It means I'm choosing family. I'm choosing you both." Before Nate could answer, a small voice piped up from the hallway. Lila, who had been listening, clutched the wooden sign tight. "Does that mean You'll stay forever? Evelyn knelt, pulling the girl close. If you'll have me, sweetheart, then yes. Forever. Lila's eyes lit up, brighter than any lantern or candle Evelyn had ever seen. She threw her arms around Evelyn's neck, nearly knocking her off balance. You smell like Mama, she whispered again. Not with sadness this time, but with a joy that made Nate's chest ache. The child's innocence carried the weight of healing neither adult had known how to begin. Nate stepped closer, his voice low, almost reverent. You didn't have to give this up for us, but you did. And I swear, Evelyn, I won't waste this chance. I won't waste you. She rose to her feet, her hand trembling slightly as Nate reached for it. For so long, he had kept his distance, afraid of losing again. But as their fingers intertwined, the fear gave way to something steadier, a recognition that second chances, though rare, were worth risking everything for. Spring unfolded slowly in Greenfield. The Whitmore home, once cloaked in silence, grew warmer with laughter, clattering dishes, and the sound of piano lessons drifting from the parlor. Evelyn helped Lila with her school projects at the kitchen table, sticky with glue and glitter. Nate found himself pausing in doorways, watching with a smile he no longer tried to hide. Evenings became rituals of small things. Board games, shared prayers before bed, and sometimes that old lullaby hummed softly until Lila drifted into sleep. One Sunday afternoon, the three of them strolled through town to attend the Easter service at the old white-steepled church. The bells tolled overhead, mingling with the smell of lilies carried in from parishioners' gardens. Neighbors greeted them warmly, nodding in quiet approval. People noticed the change. The once distant businessman now held his daughter's hand in one palm and Evelyn's in the other. Afterward, they picnicked in the park, spreading a checkered blanket beneath a budding oak tree. Evelyn unpacked sandwiches. Lila blew bubbles that danced in the wind, and Nate leaned back on the grass, his heart unburdened in a way he hadn't felt since before loss had hardened him. He turned his head to Evelyn, their eyes meeting across the sunlight and laughter. No words were needed. The truth was already written between them. That evening, as dusk settled over Maple Street, Evelyn tucked Lila into bed. The girl clutched the wooden sign with all three of their names etched together and whispered sleepily, "Now we'll never be apart." Evelyn kissed her forehead, whispering back, "Never, sweetheart. Not as long as we have each other." Downstairs, Nate poured 2 mugs of tea, waiting for her in the living room. The house glowed with a gentle lamplight, no longer haunted by shadows. He handed her a mug, their fingers brushing. For a long time, they simply sat together in the quiet, listening to the distant hum of crickets outside. Finally, Nate spoke. "I thought my chance at family ended the day Eleanor passed. I thought all I had left was work, routine, survival. But you showed me I was wrong." He looked at her, eyes steady, voice full of conviction. "Evelyn, you've given us more than a home, you've given us back hope. And for that, I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret your choice." Evelyn felt tears welling again, but they weren't the tears of doubt she had carried for weeks. They were tears of release, of belonging. She reached across the table, clasping his hand. "Then let's build this together, slow and steady, day by day." "Oh." Nate squeezed her hand gently, and in the glow of the lamplight, the future no longer seemed like a forked road demanding a sacrifice. It felt like a path they would walk together. 3 souls bound by loss, and found again by love. Outside, the wind rustled through the budding trees, carrying the faint scent of lilacs. Inside, in the warmth of that once lonely house, a new chapter had quietly begun, not a fairy tale, but a real family, forged by forgiveness, second chances, and the enduring strength of love. The story we've just shared began with an empty chair in a restaurant and a heart carrying more weight than it should. It carried us through quiet living rooms, autumn festivals, fevered nights, and the tender laughter of a child who asked for nothing more than love she could trust. In the end, what stayed with us was not grand gestures or riches, but the simple truth that when someone chooses to stay, lives can change forever. And if this story touched your heart, I'd love to know. Type the number 1 inch, the comments. If you felt something was missing, or you'd like to share a thought of your own, type 0. What can we carry from this tale? That forgiveness is not weakness, it is strength. That second chances can heal the cracks of the past. That family is not only blood, but also those who stand beside us when the world feels heavy. A kind act, like singing an old lullaby or showing up in a moment of need, can echo louder than any success written on a resume. Love, unconditional and steady, has the power to rewrite a life. And isn't that the lesson many of us, with decades of memories behind us, have already seen in our own families and communities? Think about your own dinner table. Maybe it's quieter now, with children grown and gone. Maybe you remember a time when laughter filled every chair, or when a neighbor brought a pie after a hard season. Those small gestures, sharing a meal, rocking a child, forgiving an old mistake, are the very things that built the strongest walls of home. Like the scent of Sunday pot roast wafting through a kitchen, kindness lingers long after the plates are cleared. This story reminds us that money fades, accolades fade, but love, the love that chooses, forgives, and remains, is what endures. No matter how many years we've lived, it is never too late to make amends, to mend what is broken, to become a part of someone's story again. Like a steady porch light burning at night, one act of tenderness can guide another soul safely home. So as we close, I invite you to pause and reflect. Who in your life might be waiting for a second chance? Who needs to hear that you will stay, no matter what storms may come? If this story has warmed your heart, share it with someone who could use the reminder that it's never too late to open a door, to forgive, and to love again.